Have you ever wondered why Christians talk about that same old story of a man who came and died and rose to glory? A story you think, yeah, okay, but I'm sorry, it's not for me. Well, today, I'll be directing your eyes to a vision of why Jesus' rising is either true hope from God divine or the greatest lie ever devised. Walk with me. Think back to your last funeral, when you gazed upon the lifeless face of someone you loved. Or maybe it was a friend's funeral and it was someone they loved. You walked past the rows of crying people, moving closer and leaning over to see that person one last time. Your eyes water and you begin to wonder how someone who was once alive is now gone without a sign, leaving friends and loved ones behind, and you know no matter how much you try, you can't bring them back. Or if you could backtrack to the emergency room, where doctors in scrubs and scalpels fought and grappled to keep this person breathing. And behind the room, you can see anxious people heaving, hoping that this would be the last time they see their baby, and grieving. That's only been 4 years, oh God. Why is she now leaving? Her eyes close, feet stay still, as the doctors shake their heads and the moment of dread crosses through everyone's minds. She's gone. With less time than it takes for a song to be played. And yet, in that moment, all they could wish for is to repeat every little word that child has ever said. The parents come into the room, knees dropped onto the floor, hearts sinking deeper, as they hold their child's hand, wishing they could keep her, saying, "Oh God, if only I could trade my life just to see her." Every death considered is a clear reminder of our fragile state of life under the Creator. Which brings us back to our original question of the eternal relevance of Christ's resurrection. There are many people who promise of how you'll be astonished by your ability to accomplish anything you set your mind to. But can you really set your mind to bring the dead back to life to, bridge the divide between God's hand and the world He rules under His plan? You see, God's will for man is not for man to stand and heed to no one but His own demands, but instead understand that life is given by Him and life is taken by Him. And no matter how hard man sets his mind to save, in the end, man only prolongs his time before he reaches the grave. You see, as images of God, we owe Him thanks and worship, and our rejection of God is how He casts us into death's grip. Death is the right result of judgment of a good God in His world, the product of a promise since the day our ancestors turned and spurned their worth as images of God, listening to a lie that they could make themselves images as gods and no longer worship the Creator but the created. God's promise is that man returns to the dust he was made from, and death will be a reminder of the curse we often face on unwillingly under the will of the one who is holy. But yet, it is from His will that He promises a future seed of man who fulfill God's very word set before time began of having a people who didn't live just to die, by a man dying to show how life should truly be lived. This man is this word that spoke life to dry bones, dead, lifeless, hard as stone, hopeless and cut off with no way to atone for their rebellion, as wide as the graves they filled. He said, "Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live, with sinew and skin and flesh connected, subjected to the same voice that formed the universe." This man is this God that promises death will be reversed so He could have a people whose purpose will be to live lives in obedience in the knowledge of God. This man will be the Spirit-filled King we were supposed to be, who judges justly and not by what His eyes see. He will strike the wicked with His word in a breath establishing the heights and depths of a new order, where wolves will dwell like lambs, and children with cobras, with no fear of destruction, for the world will be removed of its corruption, and life restored to God's original intention. Jesus would himself love God with all his heart and soul and strength, and endure the pain of lives lived against God with all their heart and soul and strength. His life would see rejection, acquaintance with grief. As he showed his authority, he was faced with disbelief. He who called himself the resurrection and the life endured the strife of those who called for murder, so that whoever believes in him, though he die, yet shall he live. Jesus, the ruler of disaster, demons and disease, was king over death itself as he raised the dead with ease. He spoke of his rising in the scriptures, that the Son of Man would suffer and rise 3 days after to prove that death would not be his master. Instead, death would be mastered by the men who called men out of their graves. Lazarus come out, will himself be led out and convicted of treason, receiving oppression and affliction despite his sovereign position, knowing that his death was part of God's glorious mission of fulfilling God's righteous retribution on man and his sin for his salvation. The earth quaked on the day of his crucifixion as tombs opened and curses broken and men proclaiming what God has previously spoken. Truly this was the Son of God. And 3 days after, Jesus rose as he foretold, as death could not hold him in prison. He is risen. He appeared to many and called his people ready to proclaim God's great story of a man who came and died and rose to glory. The mystery of how all will be changed at the end of time is foreshadowed through Jesus' rising in 33 Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Now at this point, you could question the validity or scrutinize the activity, the reliability of whether this resurrection was just a probability or true hope based on historical reality. And if it isn't real, we should be of most to be pitied as followers of a dead man who have wearied their lives for a lie. Death will be our doom if it were not for the empty tomb that assures us death is dead and sufferings are but birth pains for those who follow him, refining us before we close our eyes finally to gain, awaiting the return of Jesus who reigns. Because Jesus lives, we know that death is in the hands of a God who gives and takes life, but who has himself given the greatest gift of his Son, who rules in heaven, seated above all things. Death's sting is now as far gone as the sin that stained our hearts and minds, so we can now incline our hearts and minds to listen to the Word that can truly give hope to the hopeless. Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed.